In August of 2024, Russia appeared to be on the brink of a major victory. According to reports at the time, its troops were mere days away from capturing the city of Pokrovsk, an invaluable Ukrainian stronghold situated in the Donetsk region. Over a year has passed, yet still the city remains in Ukraine's control. Even now, despite having 8 times as many troops as its opponent, the Russian army continues to make zero progress in Pokrovsk, suffering one humiliating loss after another. It's a remarkable story, a testament to Ukraine's inspiring resilience and extraordinary ability to dig in and defend its most valuable strategic locations, as well as yet more evidence of Russia's astonishing incompetence. And it all began over a year ago, in the summer of 2024. In that late July and early August, Russian forces made several sweeping gains at a fairly rapid rate, taking control of various villages and small settlements dotted around central Donetsk like Pokrovsk and Lozuvske. Each capture brought them closer to Pokrovsk, and fears began to rise that the city was close to falling into enemy hands. With Russian forces gaining ground by the day, with Serhiy Dobryak, head of the Pokrovsk city military administration, ordering an evacuation on August 15. Today, the Russian army has come very close to the Pokrovsk community, with their forces positioned just over 10 kilometers from the outskirts of Pokrovsk. They're targeting critical infrastructure as well as residential buildings, resulting in civilian casualties. Meanwhile, numerous news agencies across the world published grim reports of the ongoing situation. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi, confirmed that the fighting in the Pokrovsk direction was more intense than anywhere else along the front lines, and even the nation's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, was understandably concerned about the city's future, stating that summer, "Today, Russian forces are concentrating the largest number of personnel, the largest number of weapons and cab bombs, everything they have, in the Pokrovsk direction." The situation seemed bleak, and it was made even worse by the fact that Russian forces outnumbered Ukrainians in the area by around 4-1, with an estimated 20 Russian regiments and brigades operating east of Pokrovsk at the time, for a grand total of approximately 40,000 troops. Ukraine, meanwhile, could only field 6 brigades in the area, with around 12,000 troops in total doing whatever they could to defend the city and its surrounding settlements. With every passing day, the Russians drew closer. It appeared that even in the best-case scenario, Ukraine's defenders might be able to slow the enemy's advances once they reached the city limits, perhaps preventing them from gaining full control right away, but the fall of Pokrovsk appeared inevitable before the end of 2024. Then, something extraordinary happened. Russia's progress began to slow, then stall. Days and weeks went by, but the long-awaited announcement that the Kremlin had captured the city never came. Instead of rolling into Pokrovsk with their tanks and armored vehicles, overwhelming any defenses in their way and steamrolling to victory, Russian forces found that the city was far harder to capture than they might have expected. So, even though they managed to take some of the surrounding lands and partly encircled the city, the all-important breakthrough never came. 2024 came to a close, and Russia had failed to achieve its objective. And as 2025 kicked off, the situation in the Pokrovsk sector descended into something of a stalemate. Russia's slow but steady progress came to a grinding halt, and Ukraine even managed to push the enemy back and recapture some of its lost land, with the front line becoming somewhat stable for the first time in a long time. Evidently, Russia's leadership wasn't too pleased about this turn of events. So, in March of this year, the Russian army stepped up its efforts to take the city, deploying every possible tactic they could think of in their quest for victory. They used tanks, artillery and bombs to strike Pokrovsk and surrounding settlements, attempted to further encircle the city and sever its supply lines by marching onto another nearby city, Dobropilya, and even sent sabotage groups into the city itself, disguised as local civilians, to spread chaos from within. None of it worked. Demonstrating yet more of their inherent innovation and ability to adapt in the face of adversity, Ukraine found ways to counter every single thing the Russians threw their way. They used drones, mines, and more to stop tanks and armor advancing on the city, launching a successful counter-offensive in the Dobropilya direction to isolate enemy units, and even found ways, with the aid of local Pokrovsk residents, to identify and snuff out the saboteurs one by one. So, Russia ramped things up even further. In the summer months, as part of its major summer offensive, the Russians amassed a truly gigantic force of around 110,000 troops, along with over 500 tanks, close to 700 armored fighting vehicles, over 560 artillery pieces, and more than 180 multiple launch rocket systems of varying calibers, all in the Pokrovsk area. This time, failure was not an option, and the Kremlin was confident of victory. Putin himself was desperate to capture Pokrovsk ahead of highly anticipated talks with US President Donald Trump, seemingly believing that taking the city at last would show the world that Russia was winning the war, and that Ukraine and its allies had no other option but to wave the white flag and submit to a peace deal negotiated on Russia's terms. Still, the city stood firm, seeing out the summer months and remaining in Ukraine's control once again. Which leads all the way up to the present day and Russia's latest desperate attempts to assert dominance in the area. According to the most recent reports, Russian troops have long last, after well over a year of effort, reached the outskirts of Pokrovsk, and street fighting is ongoing between the two sides. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by around 8-1, yet are still struggling to make gains and achieve their aims, as the city remains, for the time being, in Ukraine's hands, with Zelenskyy stating on October 28, "Imagine how many Russian forces are there, but at the same time, they'd have not achieved the planned result." It's another embarrassing result for the Kremlin. Even with a force that's so much larger than that of the opposing side, its army is still suffering failure after failure and loss after loss, with reports also revealing that Ukraine captured approximately 2,200 Russian soldiers in the region in the first 6 months of this year alone. Countless more have been wounded or killed in the multitude of poorly planned and pathetically coordinated assaults on the city over the course of 2025, and many more are likely to perish in the days and weeks of intense urban combat that lie ahead. Still, Russia is throwing everything it's got at the city. It reportedly has 10 times as many drones as Ukraine in the sector, according to Ukraine military sources, and some of its soldiers are repeating the sabotage strategy seen earlier in the summer, in which troops disguise themselves as civilians in order to sneak past defensive lines and infiltrate the city's center. The Russians also, unfortunately, now have fire control over all egress routes from the city, since they've managed to capture so much of the surrounding land. Because of this, it's no longer possible to safely evacuate the remaining residents. Around 1,200 civilians still live in Pokrovsk, which is only a small fraction of the city's pre-war population of more than 60,000 people. Still, it's many innocent lives that are at an increasing risk, as the Russian army doesn't have the best track record when it comes to their treatment of civilians in wartime. Indeed, reports have already emerged that Russian soldiers are opening fire on locals, as noted in a recent post from the Institute for the Study of War. Russian tactics in Pokrovsk have entrapped civilians within the city, intensifying the risk of indiscriminate civilian harm. The Ukrainian Pokrovsk military administration reported that Russian forces have fire control over all egress routes from Pokrovsk, effectively entrapping 1,200 civilians within Pokrovsk. The Pokrovsk military administration reported that Russian forces are killing civilians who attempt to evacuate both on foot and in vehicles. Thankfully, for the time being, Ukrainian forces are still able to provide food, water, and medical assistance to those that are, in effect, trapped within the city's limits, and will continue to do whatever they can to keep the local people safe from harm. There's no doubt that Ukraine's grasp of the city has started to weaken. Small squadrons of Russian soldiers are making their way through the city streets, while Ukrainian defenders are dispatched to hunt them down and take them out. The fate of the city rests in the balance, but the fact that Ukraine has held it for this long and continues to claim control of large sections of the city is a huge victory in and of itself. Russia thought it would capture this city months ago. It expected to be fully in control by now and well on the way towards taking over other locations along the famous fortress belt of Donetsk, like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, or delve deeper into the country and ever closer to its capital, Kyiv. Putin expected that he'd be able to announce Pokrovsk capture to the masses back in the summer and boast about his army's advances in his discussions with Trump and other world leaders. Instead, even now, with Russian soldiers actually in the city, the Kremlin head is still waiting for news of the victory that, in his view, is long overdue. And he might be waiting quite a while longer, as Ukraine's defenders are holding strong and have no plans of leaving Pokrovsk anytime soon. One Ukrainian major, whose brigade is stationed in the area, confirmed that there are no current plans to retreat, stating, "We're holding the city for now, it's stable chaos in there." The major, who preferred to remain anonymous when speaking with reporters, added that around 200 to 250 Russian forces have built up on the southern side of the city. The current combat situation is street fighting. This represents a big shift in the combat dynamic. For a long time, much of the fighting for Pokrovsk took place on the outskirts and surrounding territories of the city, including fields, farmland, rural roads and small settlements, with long lines of sight and wide areas of open ground. This allowed Ukrainian drones to operate with a reasonable degree of freedom and flexibility, soaring across open skies to spot their targets on the ground before honing in and wiping them out. Now, it's a completely different situation, with troops facing off against one another in city streets, relying on rubble, wrecked vehicles and other debris to give them cover as they exchange fire with their enemies. Fortunately, Ukraine has a huge advantage here, as it knows the city well. This is Ukrainian territory after all, and many of Kyiv's soldiers have been stationed in and around Pokrovsk for many months now. They know every street, every turn, every corner, and they've proven on countless occasions that they're more than capable of making the absolute most of its home turf advantage. It might not be enough to allow them to keep the city forever, but it may be just what they need to delay Russia's advances and perhaps hold out long enough for reinforcements or additional weapons to arrive. And reinforcements are already en route. The major, who spoke to the media, confirmed that Ukrainian Special Forces units and assault squads were entering the area to bolster Pokrovsk's defenses and, in his words, clean out the Russian troops that had made it inside. This was backed up by President Zelenskyy, who spoke to reporters on Monday. Ukraine's leader confirmed that, according to satellite imagery and Ukrainian drone operator reports, around 200 Russians were inside the city. He also explained that defensive positions in and around the area were being actively strengthened, and Ukraine's drones were scanning the skies to assess the situation and gather important intelligence to help the armed forces plan their next steps. Zelenskyy acknowledged that capturing Pokrovsk was clearly a top priority objective for the Kremlin, and that the enemy had vastly superior numbers and resources, but remained confident that his troops would continue to show the same courage and resilience that's become synonymous with the Ukrainian people over the last few years. He claimed that as soon as Russian soldiers crawl out from wherever they're hiding, or as soon as there is fire from one point or another, enemy forces are found and destroyed. Zelenskyy also highlighted two important takeaways from this situation. First, because Russia is so hell-bent on taking Pokrovsk by any means necessary, it's diverted forces and resources from other areas along the front lines. That means that certain sectors are now weaker, which may present opportunities for one or more Ukrainian counter-offensives further along the front. Ukraine has proven in the past that it's able to think tactically, identify weaknesses in its enemy, and strike at just the right times, in just the right places to deal lasting damage. It may, therefore, already be looking at other areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, or other regions where Russia's offensive forces have thinned, and it could carry out one or more surprise attacks of its own in the days and weeks ahead. Second, Zelenskyy pointed to the fact that the almost miraculous ongoing defense of Pokrovsk is clear proof that international aid to Ukraine is incredibly valuable and capable of making a real difference on the battlefield. It's only thanks to Ukraine's many allies and all the weapons, supplies, munitions and funds they've provided that the country's forces have been able to dig in and defend themselves for this long. As long as aid keeps coming, they should be able to maintain those same superhuman levels of resilience, not just in Pokrovsk, but other important towns and cities across their territory. Zelenskyy summed up by saying that Ukraine is still in control of Pokrovsk and Russia is repeatedly being forced to postpone its campaign plans, while also suffering heavy losses in both the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya sectors, where Ukrainian operations continue to nullify the enemy's endless offensives. It's worth noting too that Russia has not captured a single major Ukrainian city since taking Avdiivka, a major Donetsk stronghold, in February 2024. Prior to that, one of the Kremlin's most notable victories was in the bloody battle for Bakhmut, which began in July 2022, over 3 years ago. Some observers have likened that battle to the ongoing offensive in Pokrovsk, but according to the Ukrainian major at the scene, there's no comparison between the two. People are trying to compare it to Bakhmut, but these are different situations. Here, there aren't as many of them Russians, and most of them are just hiding somewhere in basements. As the major notes, Ukraine is not yet facing some sort of overwhelming, inescapable enemy offensive. It's not having to deal with dozens of tanks and armored vehicles rampaging through its city streets, or huge numbers of troops firing their AK-74s at Ukrainian fortifications. Instead, this is a relatively small and disparate Russian force, with many enemy troops simply hiding out and trying to survive while they wait for reinforcement, rather than attempting a big aggressive push deeper into the city. Several other Ukrainian sources confirmed that the situation has not yet reached any sort of critical status at this time. The Air Assault Forces 7th Corps, for example, which is fighting in Pokrovsk at this very moment, wrote a lengthy Telegram post detailing the situation. The defenders of Pokrovsk are actively countering the occupiers in the city. Recently, our defense was strengthened with new units, in particular assault troops, artillery, UAV crews, and other components of the defense forces. We're increasing the use of anti-aircraft drones and net launchers against enemy Mavics. Additionally, we're remotely mining the enemy's infiltration routes. On October 25-26, Ukrainian soldiers killed about 40 Russians in Pokrovsk. The occupiers who have entered the city are not trying to gain a foothold, but intend to advance further north. In this way, the enemy wants to disperse our defense forces and block the land logistic corridors to the city. So, at the moment, there is no talk of full control over any of the districts of Pokrovsk. On the Russian side, as usual, news reports paint a very different picture. On October 26, the head of Russia's army, General Valery Gerasimov, told Vladimir Putin directly that the Kremlin's forces had encircled around 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk and 5,000 more in the Kharkiv region, many miles away. However, think tanks like the ISW have found absolutely zero evidence to back up these claims, suggesting that Gerasimov is either exaggerating or completely making up stories and statistics to suggest that Russia is doing far better than it actually is. ISW has not observed evidence to support Gerasimov's claims. ISW continues to assess that Russian forces are making gains near and within Pokrovsk and Mirnorad that are tactically significant but likely do not portend to the imminent collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the area. It's not uncommon for Russia to blatantly lie about its battlefield exploits, and the ISW, along with other analyst groups, argues that this is all part of a broader Kremlin strategy based around misinformation. If Russia can convince the world that it's winning the war and making gains in key areas, it should be able to enjoy a more powerful position at the negotiating table and achieve the peace or ceasefire deal it desires. Fortunately, much of the world can clearly see through Putin's lies and propaganda. And no matter what the Kremlin says, the truth is that it has spent over a year attempting to take a single city and is still failing to do so, even now. In a more recent report, published on October 28, the ISW went further, stating that Russian advances remain unlikely to cause any kind of immediate collapse of the Ukrainian pocket in the Pokrovsk direction. The ISW also states that the front line around Pokrovsk is now in a fluid state, with both sides making gains in different areas. So, even as Russian troops enter more of Pokrovsk's city streets, Ukrainian armed forces are not simply standing still and have been seen assaulting Russian positions elsewhere, like in Donetsk, north of Pokrovsk, to forge their own advances. It's not unthinkable to imagine that, with enough reinforcements, resources, and aid from allies around the world, Ukraine could once more stage a stunning comeback here, wiping out the small numbers of Russian troops in the city and fortifying their positions all over again. In short, even though the Russians have made some headway, the situation remains in a state of flux. Both sides are poking and prodding at one another, making gains and suffering losses as the days go by. But Ukraine has the home advantage and the benefit of strong defensive positions that have been steadily solidified over the months and years. If the city eventually does fall, it will be a big loss for Ukraine and cause for celebration for Russia. But there will still be many more defensive strongholds just like this one standing in the Kremlin's way of total conquest, and countless brave Ukrainian soldiers ready and waiting to hold the line. Now, learn more about how Russia is desperately attempting to exaggerate its frontline successes in this video, which looks at how the Kremlin recently staged a victory in Kherson, only to be utterly embarrassed less than 24 hours later when Ukrainian troops debunked their claims. Or, for another example of misplaced Russian arrogance, watch this video, revealing how Russian troops celebrated far too early before the harsh and unexpected reality caught them completely off guard. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to watch more informative, insightful and up-to-date video reports about the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts around the world.